Well, yeah, thank you very much. I wish people did that every time we walked into a room. Okay, I'll launch into it. So look, I think it's widely assumed, if not widely articulated, that states have some sort of natural right to determine who comes into their territories. And what I want to do today is try and persuade you that that is not only false, but leads to some deep immorality, and then, because this is TEDxBrighton, leave you with some happy thoughts as to how we can resist that. Okay, so before we launch into the border, we need to think a little bit about law. And here, by law, I don't just mean formal legal systems. I do mean any kind of set of norms that govern communities. But because we're focusing on nation states today, I'm going to we can just restrict it to the formal legal systems. Now, I think any legal system that's going to be legitimate needs to be underpinned by a principle. And here's the principle. So for a system of law to be legitimate, those who are subject to the force of the law must also be offered its protection. That's what I think. Now, what does that mean? Let's unpick it a bit. If you're subject to the force of the law, then the law is claiming power over you. It's claiming power to regulate your life, regulate your relationships, determine what's acceptable behavior, and so on, and that's all backed up with the threat of punishment, incarceration, or fines in our case. What is it to be offered the law's protection? Well, I think the law has to be taking your interests, your values, and your needs into account. In some sense, the law has to be for you. Now, it's easy to motivate that principle, I think, if you're a Democrat. Democracy is a system of government, I think, in which what happens with the consent of the governed. Note that that's not necessarily involves voting, but you can see why we stumbled upon voting, I think, as a solution to the central problem of democracy, namely, how do we deal with irreconcilable disagreement? In any large enough community, we're never all going to agree on what should happen, and if I disagree with something, how can I consent to it? And I think the answer is, well, what we need is a fair process of making decisions, and a process in which I can take part. And that's why I think we have a system of voting. That's meant to be a fair process. How well our first past the post system does, I couldn't possibly comment. I digress. I don't think, though, it's just democratic systems that need to be underpinned by this principle. I think, indeed, any system of government does. Because if not, what happens is the law is claiming complete power over you. The only thing that's constraining the law is the will of the rulers. And that, I think, is totalitarianism. At the heart of totalitarianism is this idea that the state has absolute power over you, and the only thing that's going to constrain that is what the rulers find to be expedient. So there's an awful lot at stake here. Okay, so I'm going to try and use that principle to show you why closed borders are illegitimate. So let's think about borders for a moment. Okay, not all borders are like this. Not all borders are closed borders. I can leave my bedroom freely and walk into my front room, or not walk in my case, but anyway. And if I do, then I'll have crossed a border, and the norms of behaviour that govern those things will have changed, right? So, for example, in the bedroom with the right background prerequisite, it's really very acceptable to be naked with other people, much less so in the front room. If you are, you'll probably be being a bit dirty. And that's okay, right? But unfortunately, not all borders are open borders, right? Even if I had the money, I don't have the papers to go to the US. I can't jump on a plane tomorrow and spend the weekend in New York. Although, being a nice white British person, I could probably manage to get papers within about 72 hours. But if you came from Somalia or the global south, and you want to go into the countries where the monies flow, you're going to find those borders shut against you, and an incredible level of state violence employed to keep you out. And that's why we're seeing people dying in the Sahara and drowning in the Med, trapped effectively in concentration camps in the Aegean, and persecuted and harassed border bottlenecks like Calais all across Europe. Okay, so we know that happens. How does the principle apply here? Well, let's just think about it for a moment. If you're in Calais and you're trying to come to the UK without papers, you'll find the border closed against you. But the law there has to be acting on both sides of the border, right? The law the British law is claiming the power over you to stop you coming in and thwarting you, but of course you're outside of the UK's jurisdiction, so it's not offering you its protection in any sense. It's not taking your interests into account. And that's why those border spaces are so incredibly violent. The people on the other side of the border are subject to the force of a law to which they're not being offered its protection. And I think that's fundamentally illegitimate. And so we can see that this assumption that the state has a natural right to keep you out is in fact false. Now you might say, look, fine, you've got an argument to show that the principle's false and it's unjust, but you can't seriously expect us to open the border simply because you've kind of got a neat argument that you need to keep the border closed. That's just a kind of philosopher's problem. And I would say, well, fine, like I want to live in a just world. I think it's unjust. I think we can do something about it. But maybe you can make yourself happy with that much injustice. But I want to draw our attention to a feature of the UK border regime, a feature that's replicated across Europe and the US, but is one that I fight against here, so that's what I'm going to talk about. And it's namely that once you've crossed the border into the UK, if you don't have papers, if you don't have the government's permission, it's as if you're not here legally. You still remain on the other side of the border. Now, why do I say that? Well, for a start, it's illegal for you to work. It's illegal for someone to rent you a house. You can't have a driving license. You can't have a bank account. You can get only a very, very small range of social security, and then only in exceptional circumstances. There's an ever-diminishing range of healthcare services that you're entitled to, and to make it worse, if you then go to any of these kind of service providers, they're expected to check your immigration status and report that back to the Home Office. So effectively, the border is everywhere, and everyone is a border guard. Even more dramatically and more horrifically, you can be detained indefinitely for administrative purposes in so-called immigration detention centres like Morton Hall, immigration removal centres like Morton Hall. If you're a UK citizen, and so subject to the force of the law, but also offered its protection, and the government wants to lock you up, what the government has to do is go before a judge and persuade the judge and the court that you should be detained. The exception, of course, is in some terrorist-related stuff, and we should be very worried about the undermining of that principle with terrorism. But if you're a person here without papers, you can be locked up indefinitely simply because it serves the purposes of the administration. It's very clear that you are being subject to the force of the law, but not being offered its protection. Before I move on to talk about what we can do about it, I want to draw attention to the really key feature of this system, and that is that it's racist. I think a lot of people in my generation were taught by programs like Blue Peter that racism was about prejudice and power. And although, of course, prejudice and power are mechanisms by which racism works, they're not the heart of racism. Racism is simply the systematic exclusion of people from society and its goods and services because of their kind of perceived foreignness. And I don't need to have any psychological attitudes to work to exclude you from society because the things I take for granted, all I have to do is make myself comfortable with that level of injustice. And more pertinently, institutions don't have psychological attitudes. In fact, they can't have psychological attitudes, but they can work to systematically exclude people because of their origins. And that's exactly what our law is doing. If you're here without papers, the whole mechanism of the state is geared up to keep you out from society. And so we've got a brutal and racist injustice that we need to do something about. I mean, it's a huge problem. The best available estimates suggest there are around about 600,000 people here without papers. We know that about 250,000, that's 250,000 people who are immigrants, are destitute, and around about 100,000 of those people will have slept rough. So it's really something that we have to do something about. And what can we do about it? Well, I think the answer is quite a lot, fortunately. I'm an optimist. And I think the first thing to remember is that although laws govern society, they're not the only norms that govern things. Fortunately, it's not yet illegal to lie about what you've been doing to your friends, but you can generally expect your friends to be truthful when you ask them what they did at the weekend. The law, I think, in some ways discourages us from helping our neighbours. You can get yourself into all sorts of legal trouble if things go wrong when you're trying to help people, but that doesn't stop us setting up schemes that promote, based on mutual aid, that promote good neighbourliness. And so I think that's exactly the sort of thing that we've got to try and do here with the law. And also, of course, you can just ignore laws. You can break them. I think I'm not a fan of cannabis, but actually one of the reasons why the criminalization of marijuana is creaking is simply that no one's bothered by the fact that it's illegal. It doesn't prevent anyone from smoking it. And I think we need to try and bring those principles in to the struggle against the border. So, for example, the school census is going to require you to give information, ask you to give information about your immigration status and nationality to the schools. But if you're a parent, you don't have to fill that part of the census in. And if you don't fill that part of the census in, then it makes the whole exercise pointless. And it's a way we have of pushing the border back to the border. Similarly, when you go to the hospital in Brighton and it's going to be rolled out nationally, you're going to be expected to produce identity and proof of nationality so they can work out who's entitled to treatment. But you don't have to produce those documents. And if we don't, it will also strengthen the administrators and the frontline staff who want to resist being turned into border guards. And again, we can start to push back the border. Now, it's harder in employment or housing, right, because it becomes a criminal offence to employ somebody or to rent them a house. And by all means, break the law. I highly encourage you to. But obviously, it's a big risk, right? And that's one of the reasons why we set up 1,000 for 1,000. We said, look, we can find homes for people. We can bring them in by community funding. We can have recurring micro-donations from enough people. The headline was we'd have 1,000 people with £1 a month, and we'd be able to rent homes. And so far, we found homes for 7 people in Brighton, and we're expanding all the time, which is great. There are also spare room schemes. If you're lucky enough to have a spare room in Brighton or anywhere, then you can sign up to Room for Refugees from Positive Action in Housing and host somebody in your house while they sort out their immigration status. But it's not just those kind of practical things. I also think we can think about how we run our communities to make them more inclusive. You're going to hear from Tim later in the day from the Brighton Table Tennis Club, but they've been amazing about making space for refugees and asylum seekers, and they're now using ping pong to teach people English, and it's a really lovely project that increases the diversity in our communities. The Hummingbird Project, who are amazing, set up the Global Social Club in a very similar kind of way, and there are plenty of other projects in Brighton that do similar things. And the more that we amplify these projects with our support, with our voices, with our money and with our time, the more we increase the diversity and inclusivity of our society, and the more we push back against the border. And that, for me, is very exciting, because I am rubbish on the barricades. I am no good in that type of the fight. But instead, we can try and find practical ways to make our society inclusive and value diversity for the good that it is. Before I go, I want to leave you with one final thought. If you're not yet convinced that we need to open the border and we should have a diverse society, then I want to try and persuade you that we should. It's my last pitch. Okay? So I think I don't think that many people who want to keep the border closed want to keep the border closed because they want Britain to be white. I think there are a kind of tiny handful of people that have those die-hard racist views. I guess for most people, there's a kind of fear. I make that guess because I have it myself from time to time. And I think all of us are aware that we have it good here in global terms. We have a stable, functioning society. We have universal healthcare, universal education, social security, and we're rich enough to make those better if we made those political choices. And of course, change is a risk. You never know what's going to happen if you make a big change. So we kind of get scared, I think. And we don't want to do it. We want to keep our privilege. But I think we should ignore that fear, because when you're afraid, you're isolated and you're lonely, and you miss out on diversity, which is the fundamental social good. So I really think we need to open our hearts and open our minds and welcoming other people, because frankly, it's just more joyous, right? So if you haven't yet joined us in the struggle against the border, then please do, because I guarantee you that we have the most fun. Thank you very much.